we're going to go fairly quick here, but there's not a whole lot to cover. I'm just going to show you a sample of primers today and a couple sealers, and I'll do a little demonstration on how to apply one, maybe two of them, but probably just the one that you'll actually be using for the most part. Unless you really get into oil painting professionally, you're probably not going to even want to mess with the big lead primer. So something quick out of the store, like a gambling ground, will be enough for you. So we're going to break this up into a couple parts. So the first is going to be sizes. And then we're going to talk about grounds. All right, so let's first start with the foundation. We've done a little picture at one point kind of about what the layers of an oil painting are, but now we can start to discuss the layers of the canvas or the panel that are leading up to the oil painting. So this will help you to prepare anything that you may have stretched or mounted in the last week. So first we have our support. And that's everything that we talked about last week. So that could be canvas, cotton or linen, and either stretched or secured to a board, or it could just be a board. On top of this, we have size. On top of the size, we have ground. And then on top of the ground were all those layers of paint, which could be one layer, could be multiple layers. Thank you. And could you shut the door on your way out? Thanks. So today we're talking about the size and the ground. Now the first layer that goes on is the size. Does anybody know what the size is or why we need to put it on? There's a couple of reasons.
It tempers the canvas and the panel.
And it seals it.
Seals it.
Yeah, it will. A traditional size will actually resize the canvas and actually shrink it down to get snug and fit over the substrate that you have and give you a nice tight painting surface. It also will seal the canvas and prevent any moisture from migrating between your support and your painting, which we want to make sure does not happen. For example, we're oil painting right now. Oil painting does not dry quickly, as we've mentioned already. In fact, it can take quite a long time to dry. And if you're working on a support such as fabric or wood that is going to be exposed to moisture or oil for a long period of time, there is a chance that it could rot or break down the substrate. So we need to make sure we have a barrier to prevent the ground or the canvas, the support from rotting away. So that's going to be fairly important, but there's some stuff we can use to actually skip the whole size layer because it's built into the ground layer. Now,
I'm sorry, so the concern is that the paint could affect the support? Is that what I heard you say?
yep, the paint or even the ground
Okay.
could affect the support.
And the size then.
The size then acts as a barrier. That's right. So we have two sizes that we'll look at today. The first is a traditional size called rabbit skin glue. And really we can use almost any hide glue of sufficient quality. So animal hide. And I've got a little package of it here to show you what it looks like. It actually comes in these crystals. Traditionally it would come in like a sheet, and you would break up the sheet and grind it up into little powdered flakes to which you would suspend in hot water. So this is kind of what it looks like, just a powder. Now it gets kind of tacky when it starts to get wet, and the instructions to prepare it are typically listed on the package. And these instructions are actually more simple than other instructions that I've seen before, which require the use of a double boiler to heat up the water in the glue. These instructions on here are super simple. It's heat the water until it starts to bubble, remove it from heat, or from the boiler, and then slowly start to stir in the necessary amount of rabbit skin glue. And it gives you the formula for how much water to how much rabbit skin glue to add. So as you start to mix it in, I'm not going to do it today because it'll take a little too long to heat this up and get it going and even apply it. You're going to heat up the water, it'll boil, turn it off, and then when it stops boiling, you'll need to just gently sprinkle this rabbit skin glue in. You don't want to put a spoonful in because it will start to coagulate and clump together, and then you won't be able to break it up inside the water. So you're going to have to sprinkle it out and keep stirring it as you go. Keep stirring it as you go. What you'll notice is once you get the full amount of rabbit skin glue in there, it's not going to appear much more viscous than water itself. It'll still be really fluid, and you're going to think that you might need some more rabbit skin glue because it's just so watery seeming. Don't be fooled. Just follow the instructions for the amount required. Once it is thoroughly mixed, you can actually apply it to your canvas, either cotton or linen. This was a canvas that I had prepared in the materials lecture that I had taught the one day on this. And you can see how nice and tight this is. When I had stretched this on, it was actually stretched fairly loosely. I wasn't cranking it on with the pliers. There was still even some wrinkles in there. So it was actually fairly loose and stretchy when I put it on there. The rabbit skin glue acts as a proper size, so it snugs it up and tightens it to the canvas here.
Just curious, when you mix that up, I mean, roughly, is it like a tablespoon for a cup of water or something like that?
It's something like that,
thin.
yeah. It's pretty thin.
Okay.
6 tablespoons for 1 quart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does it have what you start with, a wooden spoon or a metal spoon or a plastic? Or?
I haven't heard of it making a difference, not like making the mirror shape.
Okay.
Yeah. Just make sure that you have a spoon designated for it.
Don't go for
Never
your
taught.
soup.
Although my dog has eaten rabbit skin glue before,
It is.
and you know, it'll be weird in the mouth because it's all tacky, but it's not.
It actually is, it's, what it is gelatin,
Mm-hmm.
and it is edible.
Yeah.
So
But-
knock yourself out.
I wouldn't recommend spoonfuls of gelatin, but it's up to you if you don't mind. I try to keep all of my art supply tools separate from my kitchen tools. Especially because if you have some glue on there and it dries and then you're stirring in like something warm, it'll sort of reactivate and mix into your food. So that brings me to another point, is that when you're done with this and it cools sufficiently, it will actually start to gelatinize. Yeah, and it'll be like Jell-O. Now, there are books and sources that will tell you how to reheat it if you want to reactivate it, but most conservators say that once it's gotten to that state, you should not try to reactivate it, just toss it and then make some new stuff from scratch. And you'll be surprised, you don't actually need very much to cover a fairly large support. You'll probably want to do a couple layers of it, sanding lightly between coats, just to make sure you have saturated all of the texture of the canvas and not left any exposed canvas. You need to make sure you have a nice complete film all the way around.
Well, sometimes if you put moist something or other on wood, it'll raise the grain. Does it do the same thing on the canvas, kind of exaggerate the weave?
Not that I've noticed, but it will form little crystals on there of any excess that you might have. So that's why you're going to just lightly, yeah, that's about right. Just lightly sand the top of that. And so you would do 2 or 3 coats on here, sanding lightly between each of them. Now, the conservators, like Gottingen in his book, will warn that a hide skin glue like this is hygroscopic, meaning it can take in moisture from the surrounding air. So if there are changes in humidity, or if the canvas gets wet, the glue could reactivate to some degree and your canvas could loosen up. It's therefore not recommended to utilize hide-skin glue on substrates larger than, I think it's 1 square meter on stretched canvas. On
Is that
boards,
about
it
3
doesn't
feet?
really matter. What's that?
Is that about 3 feet?
Yeah. Because rabbit skin glue is a glue, you can actually use it to adhere canvas to board. So we looked last week at utilizing the PVA glue and then laying the canvas on. Well, if you're working with raw canvas, starting with raw canvas, then this is a suitable method to create the boards that you see in the art supply store that are kind of wrapped around like this. And you would just create your pot of rabbit skin glue, take your canvas with gloves, and just reach in there and saturate the canvas with the rabbit skin glue, work it all the way around. Then place it on the board, wrap it around the edges, and just press it down. And then it will do the rest of tightening it and adhering it. You don't have to press it like you did the other board, but you need to make sure you wrap it all the way around. And then even coat the back side here with the little rabbit skin glue, because as it dries, it's going to try to pull and shrink. So if you don't have enough wrapped around the back, it's going to just pull your board, and it's already started to do that a little bit here. It started to wrench it in sort of this way here. So you'll see that on boards that
If you
this
don't
is
have
used on.
that?
Yeah, and the less you wrap around the back, the more it's going to warp on the front. So wrap enough around on the back to where it can be saturated, and then maybe even give it, you see I've given it an extra coat back there of rabbit skin glue to halt the warping of the panel.
When you press it down on the front side, do you need to use that roller?
No. Yeah, you can just smooth it out. Unless it's like a really wrinkled canvas, but even then it'll, for the most part, just tighten itself right out. So it does a lot of that roller work for you just by doing the rabbit skin glue. So
But you don't advise using it as a regular adhesive because
it's typically not
twists and-
advisable, mostly because it's hydroscopic.
Okay.
That's the big reason. So, you know, again, if your paintings are just going to be in Arizona, probably not a big deal for you. If you have any intention of taking them somewhere else where there's great fluctuations in humidity, then it might not be the choice for you. And again, if you're doing large stretched canvas, you might not want to do it. But, you know, artists still like it because you get that nice firm surface without having to do that extra work of cranking with the pliers. And also, a good point to mention too is that if you are stretching raw canvas like this, you don't want to pull it nice and tight and make it a drum like we kind of did with the primed canvas if you're going to put the rabbit skin glue on it. Because if you pull it really tight already and then you put rabbit skin glue on it, it's going to go super tight and you can open up the weave a little bit and then make it see-through. Like you hold it up to the light and you can see little holes, which I've done that before. And especially on portrait grade linen that's a little weaker, if you pull it too tight and then do the rabbit skin glue, it just opens it up. Yeah.
And so you would not, if you're using a primed linen, you wouldn't want to use the rabbit skin
No.
as an adhesive?
No, you wouldn't want to.
Aside from the hassle of it. Appropriate.
Yeah, you might, such dramatic changes occur that you may end up cracking the primer. And you know, even what we talked about last week, we're not really trying to stretch canvas, we're trying to suspend canvas. And the rabbit skin glue will just stretch it all out. So you wouldn't want to use it to adhere.
Well, I mean, if you're putting it on a panel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you wouldn't want to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll still pull it out. So our alternative to rabbit skin glue is a newer alternative called PVA size. A synthetic substitute that is not hygroscopic. You can purchase it from Gamblin. Gamblin sells it in little bottles, big bottles, gallon jugs. It's basically a diluted PVA glue that will just seal the panel for you.
Don't use it as an adhesive.
Yeah, don't use it as an adhesive. She was trying to use it as the PVA adhesive to mount her linen. And because it has something, I don't remember, like 1/10 or 1/3 the strength or something like that, your canvas will eventually peel off. Yeah, so it's good for a size, not necessarily for a glue. And again, we're talking about a size on raw canvas or raw wood. Now, it acts as a barrier, but PVA size does a poor job of actually sizing. Like, it doesn't really stretch it out like rabbit skin glue does. So you can't expect to stretch it loose and then have the PVA size do the job of tightening it up. You have to actually pull, iron out your canvas to make sure there's no wrinkles in it first before you stretch it. And then stretch it a little firmer and then apply the PVA size, because it's not going to get that much firmer after the size dries.
When you're saying iron, you're not using an iron, you're just using it as a term.
No, you can use an iron.
On raw canvas.
On raw canvas, yeah. Don't use the super high setting where you burn the fibers off, but you can gently iron or gently steam it. And if you get the smaller volumes from the art supply store, it comes folded, and you're probably going to have to do that. It's usually, I think, recommended try to steam it first to get the wrinkles out. If you can't, then you can iron it. And then if you don't want to do that, or you can't seem to get the wrinkles out, then use rabbit skin glue. Pull that all right out.
Is the rabbit skin glue, is it just reacting like with the moisture when it's like exposed? So if you have a painted surface, is it gonna, like, if you theoretically paint the front and then seal it with the back of the canvas too, will it still be hydroscopic? Will it still react?
If
or is it
you
just
cover it with paint on the back, you mean?
Yeah, or
cover it with a
something
sealer?
like
Not
that.
as much. The paint will act as a barrier.
Okay.
Yeah, we're talking about like stretched canvas like this. If I painted on it,
Yeah.
Moisture could still seep into the back,
Right.
and cause issues. So, typically the backs would be covered by something in a moisture-controlled environment. I've got a magazine, if anybody's interested in borrowing it, on conservation techniques of sealing the backs of canvases with climate-controlled little devices that they put on the back of important paintings to make sure, because hide skin glue was used back then, so they need to make sure that nothing gets into the back. Just a bunch of technical stuff you probably don't have to worry too much about.
It's kind of like OJ's glove. It's leather. It's basically animal skin, so as it got wet, it shrank. And so he couldn't get his hand into
Well,
it.
it's different, actually.
No, I mean in terms of shrinking.
I
Never mind.
can't confirm or deny these allegations.
He's
I-
guilty.
The glove doesn't fit.
Then you must have quit.
Rabbit skin glue, much cheaper than PVA for the volume you're getting. Keep that in mind too. In fact, I personally think PVA size is a little overpriced for being diluted the way it is to create a size.
But you could dilute PVA glue.
You-
same effect.
That's
You
what I was
could,
wondering.
yeah. Unless, I'm not really sure, Gamblin was unclear when I looked into it to see if there was any additional stuff they put into it to perhaps close up the film a little bit more. Maybe they do, maybe they
What
don't.
if you, can you use both on one painting?
No.
Not like
Because-
mixed together, but like, so say you, like we were talking about, like putting it in the back, would it still,
Yeah, you
React
can do
with
anything
the-
you want, but why would you want to? It's like,
well,
You
just
can't put
the-
PVA or acrylic on top of hide skin size
Okay.
Because it's an
And-
acrylic.
because it's like an acrylic, yeah. And I don't know what would happen if you tried to put rabbit skin glue on top of a PVA size, but I imagine it wouldn't be good. It would probably just flake off.
Well,
So
it
you-
doesn't like you get the tightening either, that, because you're already got the glue. So.
Yeah.
So PVA over rabbit skin glue would not be recommended.
Right, don't combine these. One or the other.
I was just thinking like, if you do rabbit skin glue like you did that one, and then when you're done
PVA in
painting,
the back?
flip it over, yeah.
maybe. You should just do a coat of oil brown on the back.
Okay.
Yeah. That would be sufficient, just oil brown on the back. So yeah, let's go ahead and clarify here. On top of this, you can use, on top of the rabbit skin glue, you can use an oil or oil alkyd or gesso. Is there anything with gesso?
Say what?
Yeah, you got it.
Gesso.
Okay. So you can use all that on top of rabbit skin glue. On top of PVA size, you can use oil or oil alkyd, and that's it.
Well, you can put acrylics on it too.
Oh, you're right, yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mike. Or acrylic.
And the other one you can't, on the rabbit skin?
Yeah, no acrylic on the rabbit skin glue. So, yeah, that's everything for our sizes. Is that pretty clear? Keep this as kind of your guide, as well as the working properties and how much effort it is to do it. And again, we're only talking about if you're buying unprepared canvas, raw canvas, or raw wood.
So if you've used the rabbit skin glue and then go through the browns and everything else, can you use acrylic on that after you finish the preparation, or should
No.
you just not use it at all?
No, because on the rabbit skin glue, you're using all things which are oil related. The only thing that's not
Gesso is
oil
hard.
related is gesso.
Yeah.
But gesso is made of pigment, chalk, and rabbit skin glue. That's what gesso is.
Oh, okay.
You're saying the stuff we buy in the store these days is, that's acrylic, it's not really gesso?
Yeah, that's acrylic
It's a
brown.
primer?
That's acrylic brown.
That's
Yeah, it's a
acrylic.
primer. It's
Okay.
acrylic. Yeah, we're not going to talk too much about gesso. I ended up not even bringing my jar in. I would be incredibly shocked if any of you decided to work on gesso. I'll mention what it is briefly. So gesso is a combination of rabbit skin glue here, chalk, which gives it its tooth and some absorbency, and whitening, like titanium or lead or something.
Titanium dioxide.
Now this is very absorbent. You need rather a lot of layers. You can do it directly on a board because it's you don't have to size it with the rabbit skin glue because it's doing that for you. But you'll notice it's like painting on drywall, kind of, if you were to do a painting on drywall. So you have to kind of build it up with layers. That's what we would use for our 7-layer Flemish glazing technique, where we do all those underlayings and then the dead layer. And by that time, you would have built up some of the oil on there, and then it would be appropriate to add the color on top of all that. Because of the nature of what this primer is, and very fragile and also very, very brittle, most of all, it's the most brittle ground you can work on. It cannot be used on a flexible support. It has to be used on a panel, preferably a cradle panel. Because if your panel starts to warp, you're just going to crack your paint later on.
So you wouldn't lay it over raw canvas?
Not at all.
Stretch.
You would never put this on any flexible substrate. So there's so many stipulations, and it's so challenging to work on. It's unlikely that you guys are going to utilize it. If you decide to start making your frame building, then you may end up using gesso, because that's also what's used to prepare a raw wood frame to accept all the stains and the leafing. So you may end up wanting to pick up a jar of it. It's something like $20 to $40 for a can that has all the powders pre-mixed into it and then really simple instructions. I think Frederick's is the one that I have, and you can buy it at Jerry's Artorama. Relatively inexpensive for the volume that you get, and its preparation is similar to rabbit skin glue preparation. If you are using it, there's a couple stipulations, like you can't wait for it to completely dry in between layers, so you have to kind of keep an eye on it, follow the instructions very, very carefully. If it dries completely, it'll become too brittle to add the next layer on top of, and you'll get a lot of cracking and things. So you have to, that's one of the reasons why traditionally built frames are so expensive, because they have to put a lot of work into even the gessoing stage to build them up. And that's where you get those frames that are like sealed on the corners and smooth all the way around and look like a solid piece of wood, which is kind of the goal of a frame. It's to look like one piece of wood carved out.
And that gesso is different from this gesso.
No, that is
Two different-
this gesso.
That is that gesso.
Yeah, for frames. Yeah.
You might want to explain that Liquitex makes gesso, but it's really acrylic primer. It's just
Yeah, we'll get to acrylic primer.
Right.
Yeah.
But they do call it gesso, so
Yeah.
even though it isn't.
Yes. It's not gesso. So it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to anybody in the art supply store and you ask them for gesso, they're probably not going to give you this. They're going to give you this, an acrylic primer. And acrylic primer is just acrylic resin and then usually some sort of chalk and some sort of whitening. So instead of the rabbit skin glue, they're using an acrylic resin which is soluble in water. And it dries to the touch, usually relatively quickly. However, acrylic primer can take up to 30 days to completely dry, sometimes up to a year if you have applied it on thickly, for all the water to completely evaporate through all the layers, because it has to kind of work all its way up. Because of that, if you're painting or if you're applying the acrylic gesso on something like a wooden or hardboard substrate, it has potential for organic materials to leak up from the support through the sides and show up in the ground. Actually, I'm sorry, back up. With an acrylic primer, they normally say that you don't have to use a size. But if you don't use a size, it's called support-induced discoloration. The organic materials could leak up while the acrylic is drying, go through the acrylic primer, and then show up as speckles, splotches, or various other things on the actual surface of the canvas. So if I were to have this panel and then throw acrylic primer on it, in a couple weeks I might have splotches show up through it if the panel is of lower quality. So there's a danger with acrylic, and you're really not supposed to paint on it until after it's completely dried, which is about 30 days. But there is something you can lay down between your support and the acrylic ground that will help to combat this support-induced discoloration. And it's an acrylic dispersion medium. So if you were going to go to the store, you would need to find something called GAC 100 or GAC 700. It's a GAC. Now these have a tighter closed film than something like PVA. So the PVA size will not work to combat support-induced discoloration. You can't use that size underneath an acrylic primer and expect it to be free of that. You'll have to use something with a tighter film like GAC 100 or GAC 700.
Does that go underneath or over?
It goes on top of your canvas or your board and underneath the acrylic primer. So it's basically a size for your acrylic primer. So you don't have to do that. It's up to you. You'll find out relatively quickly within a few weeks to a couple months if there was any support-induced discoloration. So you could just opt to not even throw that sealer on and just prime a bunch of panels and then maybe wait a month or two to see if anything's happened to it. And if it hasn't, then you're okay to paint on.
If if it is a little discolored, is the concern that it'll come through your paint?
If you're working in oil paint becomes transparent over time, so yeah. How much drying time between coats? I'm sorry. With the oil browns, it's really only necessary to wait until they're dry to the touch to be able to apply the next coat. So it could be anywhere from a week or two to a month or so before it's dry enough to put the next coat on. And then after it's dried, or after the last coat, you'll want to wait a few months before you start painting on it. You want to let it turn into a solid film.
Can't see the brush.
Oh yeah, you know, this whole brush business of art is a relatively new thing. Yeah.
Just buy the roll. Just go.
You just buy
Yeah,
it all.
I can see
Yeah.
that.
I usually will opt for quick stuff and studies like open studio stuff. I'll opt for an oil alkyd ground, which is our next on here. And the oil alkyd primer has an alkyd resin in it to help it to dry faster. So instead of waiting a month for it to dry to the touch or a couple weeks for it to dry to the touch, it'll be dry to the touch usually in a couple of days. And you will need to still wait, it's advised, at least a week before you paint on it. So it's not something that you can just prime and then in a couple of days paint. You still have to give yourself at least a week after the last coat.
As opposed to the oil which you said you had waiting.
A few weeks in between coats and then a few months after it's done.
But they oil out for just a week or so and then sand and then another week.
I've been able to do a couple days and then sand and a new coat, a couple days, sand and new coat. And usually I typically like 3 coats
Okay.
of each.
What's a good brand of that, the oil alkyd? Does Gamblin make an oil
Gamblin
alkyd?
makes the oil alkyd, Winsor Newton makes the oil alkyd. These are both oil alkyds.
Oh, that one is?
Yeah. Oil painting ground.
But it doesn't say alkyd.
It'll say alkyd if you actually read the ingredients. They count on most people looking at this stuff and be like, oh, this is a traditional oil ground, I'm going to buy it, because they're not going to like look over and see what it's made out of, or even the instructions on how to apply it.
What is the disadvantage? Because it seems like a lot of advantages to the alkyd. Are there disadvantages compared to them?
The only disadvantages I have noticed have been in the feel of the paint as it's laid on top. It does have a slightly more, if I had to use a word, I would say plasticky feel as you paint on top of it. Almost like a painting on an acrylic painting sort of feel to it. Like if you painted on a dry acrylic painting before, that's kind of what it feels like. So to combat that, I make sure I apply it nice and thin to expose the weave and then just build it up in a few layers so it doesn't get too plasticky. I've seen people just really lay this on, and even on the Gamblin website, I think it shows how to use a roller on it and whatnot, and it makes it very plasticky feel overall. So it doesn't catch the paint quite the same way, but it's composed again of the same stuff. You have an oil alkyd, a whitening, and some chalk.
Do you apply it with a brush rather than a roller or a spatula?
You can apply it with a brush or a firm roller. The roller will give you some texture. If say you're working on just an ampersand panel and you're not going to put linen on it or anything, you just want to prime the panel, these oil alkyds dry fast enough where you can just go ahead and prime right on the board. And as long as you trust the board, you don't have to seal it with the GAC 100. So like if you're just going to get an ampersand panel, which is an art board, it's engineered to be artist grade, so free of all the impurities, then you can just take a Gamblin primer and throw it right on here and you'll be good to go. The roller, you can select a roller of any nap depending on how much texture you want. So if you want it to feel like it's got some texture, get a roller with a little bit of nap as you lay it on there, and then after it's dry, sand it down a little bit and it'll simulate weave a little bit. And you can tell some companies will use a roller to apply their oil ground. I think the Clayson's does for some of its stuff because you can, if you look closely, you're not seeing weave in some of their linen. You're seeing basically roller and nap in it. So it's certainly something you can do to add a little texture there. Or you can make it super smooth. It's up to you.
So you wouldn't be able to clean those then. You basically have to throw them out. The rollers.
Clean what? You can. You have to clean with mineral spirits.
Okay.
So any petroleum distillates. I usually, well, in my studio at home, I would have one jar with mineral spirits in it, and then I would put my primer brush in there and sort of close the cap on it and put it in the cabinet, and it just keeps my brush usable in between the month or few months when I need to prime next, and then I pull it out and then just dry it off and then prime. Because to be honest, I've never been able to successfully clean off a primer brush after I've used oil alkyd on it.
And rollers, you're basically tossing.
Yeah, rollers are pretty disposable, so it's not really gonna be viable.
Is it more costly than an oil primer?
No, they're about the same or a little cheaper sometimes. Yeah, but I think I think the Gamblin here, when I ordered online, may have been like $35 or $40 for the size. The Windsor Newton, I think, was a little bit more, so it was $35 to $50. And you can get, Fredericks makes a traditional oil ground that is around that price as well, that I don't believe is an alkyd. I think it's just titanium primer that Jerry's Armstrong sells here.
Not the difference in quality in the brands.
No. But Windsor Newton tends to dry a little faster, but smells more.
Okay.
So I can't use it around Brittany. The Gamblin doesn't have as much of a noticeable smell, but it takes longer to dry. And I like the feel, if memory serves me correctly, of all the panels I've painted on, I tended to favor the Windsor Newton one for the feel, for whatever reason. When I look back at the paintings, and it has to do to some degree to the way my brush makes marks on the canvas. The Windsor Newton, I think, tends to preserve the individual hair marks a little bit more. But also, you'll notice a difference in working consistency, the feel, the viscosity. Windsor Newton can be brushable right out of the canister, which, another point for Windsor Newton, just with a firm bristle brush like this.
Once dry, you would send, so.
Yeah, and then Gamblin has to typically be scraped on with some sort of scraper palette knife.
Once it's dry, you could sand it lightly.
Yeah, sand lightly between coats, and then you don't have to sand the last coat if you don't want to.
How many coats do you advise?
2 to 3.
2 to 3. Okay.
Yeah. Now, oil ground, because of its strength, oil ground and oil alkyd typically is recommended with 2. And that's, I think on Gamblin it says, it actually says on here, because this is, because of the higher percentage of pigments, painters need only apply 2 coats of Gamblin ground instead of the recommended 4 coats of acrylic gesso. So they're saying that you should be able to get away with 2 coats, and that's certainly to get just your white surface. But then an additional coat will give you a slicker surface if you want a slicker surface to paint on.
Again, wait days between coats.
Yep, until it's dry to the touch. You don't want it to be tacky, because you'll see if we have time here, and I work it on here with the Gamblin, you have to really work it in there before you can brush it smooth. And if it's still tacky, you're going to just scrape off what you have underneath.
When you were preparing your panel for the orange painting upstairs, I remember when we were still in drawing, you were applying something. Is that what you were
Yep,
applying?
it was a few coats of these guys. Yeah.
With the brush over and over.
Yeah, I don't remember which one of these it was. But yeah, and you can certainly do a large panel like that, lay your linen down on it and glue it, and then do a couple coats of this, and then afterwards just cut the whole thing up, and then you've got a ton of panels. You can do it all at once.
On the board, do we need to do the sizing as well as?
So with a good question, with an oil alkyd, again, you're supposed to be able to apply it directly to the board, but only do that, I would advise, if it's a board of known quality.
Wood panel. You wouldn't
Wood,
do it on
basidites.
paperboard.
I've never tried, but theoretically you could. You're supposed to be able to paint on some of that museum board stuff.
Otherwise, would you use a GAC again? Like
To seal,
that's
yeah, to seal it,
MDF
yeah,
and,
yeah.
You would use GAC.
If you have a substrate of unknown quality,
Unknown
use GAC.
quality, thank you.
If you buy some
the growth
at the hardware
dispersion, medium, to seal it, and then you can go right on top of this. What time are we at here?
It's 20 of
Been an
10.
hour and 10 minutes.
Okay, so we won't have time to apply this today. I need to do a bunch of panels at some point in time, so I'll let you know when I am doing it. But I'll describe to you what it is. It's really not that complicated. The biggest mistake I see most people do is apply this too thickly instead of building up thin layers. I mean, if you build it up too thickly, you just end up with big streaks through your gesso, which some people like Richard Schmidt likes big brush strokes through the primer so that it's, when the paint lays on top, it has an interesting optical effect. But I would take something like this, and this would be for an oil primer, for something like that, or for an oil alkyd like this. I'll typically scoop some of this into a bowl. You can see all those bowls I have back there on the corner of the table there. So I'll scoop it into a bowl, and then close the cap back up because you want this to stay airtight or else it will dry out. And it does have a little piece of paper on there to sort of act as a film, so you remove the paper, don't throw it away, set it off to the side, use your primer, or pour your primer out and put the paper back on, reseal this and set it back aside. The traditional oil browns like this, they do put some oil on top of the primer, so you want to carefully pour that off into a cup, utilize the primer you need, pour the oil back, and then reseal. Okay? So, once you've poured your primer into the cup, you'll scoop some out with your spatula, then sort of like with the PVA, we'll just kind of scrape out, even it out as much as possible. Once we've dispersed it fairly evenly and removed any excess, that's important. You want to get as much excess off. It's better to do this in a couple thin coats rather than one thick, goopy coat, which is going to be hard to work with. So we remove all that excess, get it moved from the sides, or coat the sides, whichever you're going to do. With the Gamblin ground, if you want to seal the Gamblin and the Winsor Newton's oil alkyds, you can seal the whole panel by going all the way around to prevent any moisture from getting in anywhere. That way you don't have to polyurethane anything. You can just Gamblin coat the whole bad boy. Then we set this aside, get our large bristle brush, and then we just work it out, work it out, work it out, work it out. And then you'll actually get some buildup when you do this, where it starts to dry, and as it dries, it may start to kind of pill a little bit. So every once in a while, I'll have a paper towel on the side here, and I'll clean my brush off, and then I'll go back, work it out, clean my brush off, work it out, and then eventually you'll coat the whole thing. Now, and smooth it all out. That's really intended for if you want some weave to still be there. If you want to actually have weave on your stretched canvas or on your panel, if you don't care about the weave, it doesn't really matter. You could just slap this stuff on with this guy and then just work it out and try to do your best to remove any creases and then just leave it like that and then let it dry. If you don't care. But if you don't care about the weave, it's probably not necessary to do canvas on a board. Right, you just prime the board right there.
And that would be with a roller or a brush.
With the spatula.
Or you still would use a spatula.
Yeah,
on the board.
if it's on the
Okay.
board, you can spatula it out, and then if you want, you can roll it with a very even a brayer would be better.
And
Yeah,
if you wanted a tooth on that, you could use a
roll
roller.
it with a nap.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways to apply it, and it just depends on if you want weave, if you don't want weave. I like just a very small amount of weave to not be distracting, but to give me enough tooth. So it's just up to you.